Darnell adjusted the strap of his leather bag as he walked through the quiet, upscale neighborhood. The streetlights cast a soft glow on the clean pavement, and the distant hum of a few cars filled the evening air. Darnell had just finished attending a charity event organized by his university and was now heading home. Dressed neatly in a button-up shirt and slacks, he looked like any other young man going about his business. Yet he felt the weight of someone's gaze on him. He turned his head slightly, spotting a police car parked at the corner. Its headlights were off, but Darnell could see the silhouette of the officer inside. Darnell's heart skipped a beat, but he reminded himself to stay calm. He wasn't doing anything wrong. He had every right to be here. The car slowly rolled forward, and soon the flashing red and blue lights came on. A voice crackled through the speaker. "Stop where you are, and put your hands where I can see them." Darnell sighed and complied, raising his hands. He had been through similar situations before and knew it was best to stay calm. The officer, a middle-aged man with a stern face, stepped out of the car. His name tag read Barnes, and his eyes scanned Darnell from head to toe with suspicion. "What are you doing here?" Barnes asked, his tone sharp. Darnell kept his voice steady. "I'm heading home. I was at a charity event." Barnes frowned. "This isn't a neighborhood people like you usually hang around in." The words stung, but Darnell didn't let it show. "I'm not causing any trouble, officer. I live a few blocks away." But Barnes wasn't satisfied. He asked Darnell for identification, which Darnell calmly handed over. The officer glanced at it briefly, but his expression didn't soften. Instead, he stepped closer. "Your story doesn't add up," Barnes said, his voice filled with doubt. "Why don't you come with me to the station? We'll sort this out there." Darnell hesitated. "Officer, I haven't done anything wrong. I'm just trying to get home." But Barnes wasn't listening. He reached for his handcuffs, clearly intent on arresting Darnell. Realizing there was no point arguing, Darnell sighed deeply and held out his hands. "Fine. Let's go." Barnes smirked as he cuffed Darnell's wrists. "You're smarter than most. Just doing my job," he muttered, though the satisfaction in his tone was clear. As they drove to the precinct, Darnell sat quietly in the back seat, his mind racing. He could feel the frustration bubbling inside him, but he refused to let it show. He remembered the advice his father had given him. Always stay calm, no matter what. Never let anyone see you lose control. With his hands still cuffed, Darnell subtly used his phone to send a single-word text. "Help." In the driver's seat, Barnes glanced at him in the rearview mirror, clearly enjoying the moment. "Hope you like spending the night in a cell," he said with a sneer. Darnell didn't respond. He knew this was far from over. His father would be furious when he found out. Little did Barnes know, he had just made the worst mistake of his career. The ride to the station felt longer than it should have. The city lights outside the window blurred, and Darnell couldn't help but think about what was happening. He had always known that people like Officer Barnes existed, people who judged others based on their skin color, appearance, or background. But he never thought he would be on the receiving end of such unfair treatment. As the car pulled into the precinct, Darnell straightened up in his seat, taking a deep breath. He wasn't just some random guy to be pushed around. He had rights. He had a family. He had a future. The moment the car stopped, Officer Barnes opened the door and roughly pulled Darnell out. "Move it," he ordered, pushing him toward the entrance. Inside, the station was busy. Officers moved back and forth, talking, typing on computers, and answering phones. The room smelled of coffee and paperwork. It wasn't the first time Darnell had been inside a police station, but he never imagined being the one in trouble. He thought about his father, Police Commissioner James Caldwell, who had always taught him to stay calm in difficult situations. His father had worked hard to keep the community safe, to do the right thing, even when others around him didn't. Darnell knew that the truth would come out. It always did. As they walked toward the holding cells, Officer Barnes spoke again. "You can sit there until we figure out what to do with you." It won't take long, unless you want to make this more difficult. Darnell said nothing. He could feel Barnes' eyes on him, but he refused to let the officer get under his skin. Sitting down on the cold metal bench, Darnell looked around. He was in a small room with only a few other people, all of them waiting for their turn. Some looked nervous, others defeated. Barnes walked over to a desk and began chatting with a couple of his colleagues. "Got a good one today," Barnes bragged. "Caught him loitering in one of the nicest parts of town." Darnell's heart sank. He knew what this was about. It wasn't about loitering. It wasn't about anything he had done wrong. It was about the way Barnes saw him, just another person to look down on. A few minutes later, Darnell was allowed to make a phone call. Barnes handed him the phone, but not before giving him a pointed look. "Make it quick. You're not getting any special treatment." Darnell dialed a number he knew by heart. His father's number. As the phone rang, his mind raced. He didn't know how long it would take for his father to get the message. He didn't know what would happen next. But one thing was certain: he wasn't going to stay quiet. The phone clicked, and a voice on the other end spoke. "Hello. Dad, it's me," Darnell said, keeping his voice calm. "I need you to come to the precinct. I've been arrested." There was a brief pause. Darnell could hear his father's breath on the other end. "What happened?" Commissioner Caldwell asked, his voice steady and controlled. "I was just walking home, and this officer, Barnes, stopped me. He said I was loitering, and now I'm here." "Stay calm," his father instructed. "I'm on my way." Darnell hung up the phone, his heart heavy but knowing help was on the way. He glanced up at Barnes, who was busy chatting with another officer. Darnell took a deep breath, preparing for whatever would happen next. As Darnell sat in the small, sterile room of the precinct, the minutes dragged on. The sound of the ticking clock was the only noise, punctuated by the muffled voices of officers talking in the hallway. He could hear snippets of their conversations, but it all seemed distant, like it wasn't happening to him, but to someone else. He leaned back against the cold, hard bench and closed his eyes for a moment. His mind wandered back to his childhood, to the lessons his father had taught him. Commissioner James Caldwell wasn't just any police officer. He was the police commissioner, one of the most respected figures in law enforcement. But more than that, he was a father who cared deeply about integrity and justice. Darnell remembered the times when he was younger, sitting at the dinner table, listening to his father talk about his work. He wasn't just focused on catching criminals or making arrests. What mattered to him was doing what was right, even when it wasn't easy. He always told Darnell, "Do the right thing, son, even if no one else is watching. It's your character that matters most." His father had always been a role model, a man who stood tall in the face of adversity and who never let power corrupt him. Darnell admired that. He wanted to follow in his father's footsteps, to be someone who made a difference, even if it was in small ways. But tonight, sitting here in this cold, dimly lit room, everything felt uncertain. How could someone like Officer Barnes, someone so narrow-minded, be allowed to hold so much power? How could he judge Darnell without knowing anything about him? Darnell was just trying to live his life, but Barnes had decided that wasn't good enough. Darnell thought about how things would have been different if Barnes had simply taken the time to listen. If he had just asked a few questions instead of assuming the worst, things might have turned out differently. But that wasn't the world Darnell was living in, was it? As the door opened, Darnell's thoughts were interrupted. Officer Barnes stepped in, holding a clipboard and looking pleased with himself. "So what's the story, huh? You think you can just walk around these streets without anyone noticing?" Barnes said, his voice dripping with mockery. Darnell didn't respond right away. Instead, he stood up and faced the officer. He knew this wasn't going to be easy, but he was tired of keeping quiet. "I've done nothing wrong," Darnell said firmly. "I was simply walking home after attending a charity event." Barnes scoffed. "Charity event, huh? Sounds like something a lot of people use to hide what they're really up to." Darnell didn't flinch. "You have no idea who I am or what I'm about. Just because you don't like how I look or where I'm from doesn't give you the right to treat me like this." There was a moment of silence, and for a brief second, Barnes looked like he might say something more, but he just shook his head instead. "You're not so smart after all." Darnell took a deep breath. "I'm not here to argue with you, officer. But I do know one thing. My father is going to hear about this. You'll have to explain yourself to him." Barnes paused, and for a split second, his expression faltered. He seemed to realize that Darnell wasn't just some random person, but the officer quickly regained his composure and smirked. "Your father," Barnes said, raising an eyebrow. "Who's your father?" Darnell looked the officer directly in the eyes. "My father is Commissioner Caldwell. You'll be hearing from him soon." Barnes' eyes widened slightly, and for the first time, Darnell saw a hint of nervousness in the officer's face. He quickly turned and left the room without another word, leaving Darnell to wonder how long it would take for his father to show up and set things right. The phone call Darnell had made was short, but it was all he needed to do. His father, Commissioner James Caldwell, had always been a man of action, and Darnell knew he didn't have to say much for his father to understand the urgency. As Darnell sat waiting in the holding room, the minutes seemed to stretch on forever. He couldn't help but replay the events in his mind, each detail growing clearer. It wasn't just that he had been arrested. It was the way Officer Barnes had treated him, the way he had made assumptions without any reason. The more Darnell thought about it, the more it troubled him. But he knew one thing for sure. His father wouldn't let this go. Darnell trusted his dad completely. The commissioner had worked his entire life to make the police force a better place, a fair place. He wouldn't let anyone misuse their power. Darnell's thoughts were interrupted when the sound of footsteps echoed through the hall. He looked up, expecting to see another officer coming to question him. But instead, the door swung open, and there stood his father, tall and strong, with a look of calm determination on his face. "Dad." Darnell stood up quickly, relief flooding through him. "Son," Commissioner Caldwell said, his voice steady as always. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," Darnell replied, though his voice carried a touch of frustration. "But this is ridiculous. I didn't do anything wrong." Barnes just. "Sha, I know," his father said, cutting him off gently. "We'll sort this out." Commissioner Caldwell turned to the officer standing guard by the door. "I'd like to speak with my son, privately." The officer hesitated, but with a nod, he stepped out of the room. Once the door closed behind him, Commissioner Caldwell turned back to Darnell. "Tell me everything. What happened?" Darnell didn't hold back. He explained everything. From the moment Officer Barnes had stopped him on the street to the way he had been treated in the precinct. He told his father about Barnes' mocking attitude and how the officer had ignored his calm and respectful responses. When he finished, Caldwell listened in silence, his expression hard to read. After a few moments, he sighed and shook his head. "This isn't the first time Barnes has acted like this," he said quietly. "I've had complaints about him before. I've even spoken to him about his behavior, but it seems like some people don't learn." Darnell's eyes widened. "You knew about him?" Caldwell nodded. "I've kept an eye on his actions, but sometimes it's hard to catch everything. And he hides behind the badge, thinking it gives him power over others." Darnell was quiet for a moment, the weight of the situation settling in. He had always known that his father dealt with a lot of pressure as the police commissioner, but hearing that Barnes had been a problem before made him feel even more determined to make sure things change. "Don't worry," Caldwell said, as if reading his thoughts. "I'm going to make sure this gets handled the right way. You won't have to deal with him again." Darnell nodded, feeling a bit of relief, but at the same time, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just about him anymore. This was about something bigger, about making sure that what happened to him didn't happen to others. "I'll take care of it," Caldwell said, his voice firm with authority. "I won't let this slide. Barnes needs to be held accountable." Darnell smiled, grateful for his father's support. "Thanks, Dad." With one last look at his son, Commissioner Caldwell turned to leave. "Stay here, son. I'll take care of everything." As Darnell sat back down, a sense of calm washed over him. He knew his father would handle it. He always did. But more than that, he knew this was just the beginning. Change was coming, and he was going to be part of it. Darnell sat in the quiet room, trying to ignore the low hum of voices coming from the hallway. The hours seemed to crawl by as he waited for his father to handle everything. He knew that, as the police commissioner, his father's word carried weight, but still, Darnell couldn't help but feel anxious. What if this dragged on longer than he expected? What if Officer Barnes found a way to make things worse for him? The door suddenly opened, and in stepped Officer Barnes, looking more serious than he had before. He still wore that same arrogant expression, but something in his eyes suggested he was uneasy. Maybe it was because he had just learned who Darnell's father was, or maybe he was starting to realize that he had made a huge mistake. "All right, kid," Barnes said, his voice gruff. "Let's get this over with. I need to ask you a few questions." Darnell raised an eyebrow. "Ask me whatever you want, but I'm not guilty of anything." Barnes didn't seem to appreciate the challenge in Darnell's tone, but he sat down across from him anyway. "I'm just trying to figure out what you were really doing out there on the streets at that hour." Darnell shook his head. "I already told you. I was on my way home after a charity event." Barnes leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "Charity event, huh? Seems like a nice cover for whatever you were actually doing." Darnell held his ground. "I don't need to explain myself to you. I've done nothing wrong." The tension in the room grew, and for a moment, Barnes seemed to realize that his usual tactics weren't working on Darnell. Instead of getting angry or defensive, Darnell was calm, even a little bored. He wasn't going to let this officer get to him. Barnes shifted in his chair, trying a different approach. "You know, people don't just walk around this neighborhood at night for no reason. This is a nice part of town. People like you don't belong here." Darnell's eyes flashed with anger, but he forced himself to stay calm. "People like me," he repeated. "What does that even mean? You think just because I'm black, I don't belong here? This is my city too." Barnes opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, the door opened again. This time, it was someone Darnell didn't expect. Commissioner Caldwell stepped into the room, his presence filling the space instantly. He was calm, his face neutral, but Darnell could see the quiet authority that radiated from him. "Barnes," Caldwell said, his voice steady, "I'd like a word." The tension in the room was immediate. Barnes looked flustered, clearly surprised to see the commissioner. He tried to cover it up, but it was clear that he knew he was in trouble. "Commissioner," Barnes said, standing up awkwardly. "I was just—" Caldwell raised a hand to stop him. "I'm aware of what you were doing, Barnes, and I'm not happy about it." Barnes went silent, unable to find an answer. Darnell watched as his father moved toward the desk, taking a seat across from the officer. He could tell that this wasn't going to end well for Barnes. "I've been hearing complaints about your behavior for some time now," Caldwell continued, his voice firm but controlled. "You've crossed the line, Barnes, and this time, I'm going to make sure the department knows about it." Barnes' face went pale, his earlier confidence fading fast. "Sir, I didn't mean to." "You didn't mean to," Caldwell interrupted. "I don't have time for excuses. You've made a habit of treating people unfairly, and it ends now." Darnell sat back, watching his father take control of the situation. He had always known that his father was a man of integrity, someone who wouldn't let things slide when it came to justice. Now, it was clear that Barnes was going to face the consequences of his actions. As the commissioner and Officer Barnes exchanged words, Darnell allowed himself a small moment of relief. He knew things would be all right. With his father's help, he wouldn't have to endure this injustice for long. The sound of the door opening felt like a sudden rush of air in a quiet room. Darnell looked up and saw his father standing in the doorway, his calm yet commanding presence filling the small, sterile space. Commissioner James Caldwell wasn't just any man. He was a respected figure in law enforcement, known for his fairness and strong sense of justice. In that moment, Darnell felt a weight lift off his shoulders. His father had arrived, and things were about to change. Darnell stood up immediately, his heart racing. He had been sitting there for what felt like an eternity, and just seeing his father gave him a sense of peace. The tension in the room shifted as Darnell could feel the difference in energy. No longer was it just him facing Officer Barnes alone. Now, the commissioner was in control, and that made all the difference. "Dad," Darnell said quietly, his voice filled with relief. Caldwell nodded toward his son, his gaze briefly flicking to Barnes, who had shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Barnes was clearly not expecting the commissioner to show up this quickly. He had been confident up until now, but seeing Caldwell walk into the room put a damper on that attitude. "Are you all right, son?" Caldwell asked, his voice steady and calm. "I'm fine," Darnell replied, but his frustration was still clear in his eyes. But this shouldn't have happened. Caldwell turned his attention to Barnes, his expression remaining unreadable. "Officer Barnes," he said coolly, "I believe I told you before about the importance of treating all citizens fairly. What happened here today? What exactly is going on?" Barnes, clearly caught off guard, tried to put on a confident front. "I was just doing my job, Commissioner. I thought the suspect was acting suspicious." The commissioner's eyes narrowed slightly. You thought he was acting suspicious? Officer, you don't arrest people because of what you think. You arrest them because of facts, evidence, and from what I've heard, there's no evidence, just a prejudiced assumption. Darnell could see the shift in Barnes' demeanor. The officer, who had once been so sure of himself, was now visibly sweating, fumbling for words. The confidence he had earlier displayed had all but disappeared. I didn't know he was." Barnes began to stutter. "His name is Darnell, and he is not a suspect," Commissioner Caldwell said firmly. "You've overstepped your authority, and I'm not going to let this go unnoticed." There was a heavy silence in the room. Barnes looked like he wanted to protest, but he knew better than to argue with the commissioner. Darnell's father was not the kind of man who would back down, and everyone in the room knew it. The commissioner turned back to Darnell. "Son, I'm sorry you had to go through this," he said, his tone softer now. "You should never have been treated this way." Darnell nodded, feeling the weight of his father's words. He had always respected his father's ability to stay calm and collected, even in the toughest situations. It was one of the things Darnell admired most about him. "I'll take care of this," Caldwell said to Darnell, his voice steady as always. "We'll make sure Officer Barnes is held accountable for his actions. No one gets to treat you, or anyone else, like this." Darnell felt a surge of gratitude, but there was also a sense of determination in his heart. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about making sure things like this didn't happen to anyone else. He had to be part of the solution, just like his father. With one last look at Barnes, Commissioner Caldwell motioned for Darnell to follow him. "Let's go, son. We're done here." As they walked out of the room together, Darnell knew this was just the beginning. It wasn't just about fixing this one mistake. It was about ensuring that justice would be served, and that people like Barnes would never again be able to abuse their power. And with his father by his side, Darnell was more certain than ever that change was possible. The hallway was quiet as Darnell followed his father out of the holding room. The weight of the moment seemed to hang in the air, but he felt a sense of relief. His father, Commissioner James Caldwell, had shown up when it mattered most. The injustice of the situation had been acknowledged, and now they were going to make sure it didn't go unnoticed. They walked side by side toward the exit, the sound of their footsteps echoing off the walls. Darnell glanced at his father, feeling a mix of emotions. He was grateful for the support, but also frustrated by the way things had played out. The more he thought about it, the more angry he became. Angry that a man like Officer Barnes could get away with something like this, simply because of his prejudices. As they reached the exit, Commissioner Caldwell paused and turned to Darnell. "Son, I know this hasn't been easy, but this situation doesn't end here. We need to make sure this doesn't keep happening. We can't let people like Barnes continue to use their badge to hurt others." Darnell nodded, his mind already racing with the possibilities. His father had always talked about making a difference, but now it felt personal. It wasn't just about the right thing to do. It was about ensuring that people were treated fairly, no matter their background. He was ready to take action, to make sure that no one else had to go through what he had. "I won't let it slide," Darnell said firmly, looking his father in the eyes. "This has to stop. No one should have to feel the way I did today." Commissioner Caldwell gave him a proud look, then turned to leave. "We'll make sure of it, but you don't have to worry. I'm going to make sure Barnes faces the consequences of his actions." The two of them walked out of the precinct together, the doors closing behind them with a soft thud. The cool night air felt like a fresh start, as if the city itself was taking a deep breath, ready for change. The next day, Darnell's phone rang. It was his father. "Son, we've got a meeting." The commissioner's voice came through the phone. "I've spoken with Internal Affairs, and we're going to have an official review of Barnes' actions. I want you to come with me. It's time we made sure this doesn't happen again." Darnell felt a rush of adrenaline. He was about to step into a room where the truth would be laid bare, and he wasn't about to back down. He had always believed in the power of truth, and now he was going to see it work for him and others like him. When they arrived at the meeting, Darnell noticed that the atmosphere was tense. Officers and officials were gathered around a large table, and it was clear that this was no small matter. Commissioner Caldwell took his seat at the head of the table, and Darnell sat beside him. The room fell silent as Caldwell began to speak, his voice steady and commanding. "We are here to discuss an incident involving Officer Barnes. His behavior was unacceptable, and we will ensure that there are consequences. But more importantly, we need to look at how we handle situations like this in the future. No one should ever feel the way Darnell did last night, unfairly targeted and unjustly arrested." Darnell listened intently, his heart pounding. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the moment when things would finally change. "As of today," Caldwell continued, "Officer Barnes will be placed on administrative leave pending the investigation. We will make sure this never happens again." Darnell glanced around the room, his confidence growing as he realized that change was within reach. His father wasn't just speaking for him. He was speaking for everyone who had ever been treated unfairly. And Darnell would be there, every step of the way, making sure that voice was heard. The next few weeks moved quickly. The investigation into Officer Barnes was underway, and the word about what had happened that night spread through the department like wildfire. Darnell could sense the change in the air. Things were starting to shift, but it wasn't just about Barnes anymore. It was about the bigger picture, about making sure that people like him wouldn't be able to misuse their power again. As the days passed, Darnell tried to carry on with his life, but his thoughts were never far from the events of that night. The more he thought about the injustice he had faced, the more determined he became. His father had always told him to stand up for what was right, no matter the cost. Now, Darnell was living that lesson every single day. One afternoon, as he was walking to his car, Darnell received a call from his father. "Son, we need to talk," Commissioner Caldwell said, his tone firm. "The investigation is over, and we have the results." Darnell's heart skipped a beat. What happened? "The department has reviewed Barnes' actions. There's no way around it. His conduct was unacceptable. He's been placed on indefinite suspension, pending a full review of his actions," Caldwell explained. "This isn't just about him being punished. It's about making sure the whole department knows this kind of behavior won't be tolerated." Darnell let out a sigh of relief. He had known his father wouldn't let Barnes get away with it, but hearing the confirmation made it feel real. This wasn't just a victory for him. It was a victory for everyone who had ever felt unjustly targeted. "I want you to be there," Caldwell continued. "We're having a department-wide meeting to discuss the investigation and what comes next. I think it's important that you speak too. You've been through this, and your voice matters." Darnell agreed, feeling a mix of nervousness and excitement. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but it was the right thing to do. He wasn't just speaking for himself anymore. He was speaking for everyone who had ever been treated unfairly by someone in a position of power. The day of the meeting arrived, and the atmosphere in the room was charged with anticipation. Officers and officials were gathered around the large conference table, and everyone fell silent as Commissioner Caldwell stepped forward to address the group. "Thank you all for being here today," Caldwell began. "We're here to discuss the investigation into Officer Barnes and the steps we're taking to make sure this never happens again." Barnes' actions were not just an isolated mistake. They reflect a deeper issue within our department, and we need to address it. Darnell sat quietly at the table, his heart pounding. This wasn't just about holding Barnes accountable. It was about making sure the department moved forward in a way that valued fairness and respect for every citizen. "Darnell," Caldwell said, turning to his son, "I want you to speak now." The room fell silent as Darnell stood up, feeling the weight of every eye in the room on him. But instead of being afraid, he felt a quiet strength. This was his chance to make a real difference. "I don't want anyone to go through what I went through," Darnell began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I was just walking home, minding my own business, and I was treated like a criminal. I didn't deserve that. No one does." He paused, taking a breath before continuing. "This isn't just about me. It's about making sure every person in this community, no matter their background, feels safe and respected. If we want to build trust with the people we serve, we need to lead with fairness and understanding. That's the only way things will change." There was a long pause after Darnell finished speaking, and then, one by one, the officers in the room nodded in agreement. The atmosphere had shifted, and Darnell could feel it. They were listening. Commissioner Caldwell addressed the room again. "Darnell's words are the truth. We are committed to making real change, to rebuilding trust with the community. We will not tolerate anyone in this department abusing their power." As Darnell sat back down, he realized that this moment wasn't just about punishment. It was about growth, learning, and creating a better future. Barnes might have been the one to make a mistake, but it was the department as a whole that needed to learn from it. The room was quiet for a few moments, but the sense of determination was clear. The department had made a promise to do better, and Darnell knew they would. For the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of hope for the future. The wheels of change were in motion, and he was proud to be a part of it. It had been a few months since Darnell had walked out of the police precinct, confused and frustrated by his unfair treatment. Yet, as he looked back on the experience, he realized that the journey had only just begun. His life had changed that night, and in many ways, the city had too. Darnell had made sure that his voice was heard. He had stood up for himself and for everyone who had ever been wronged by the system. With his father's support, he had helped bring attention to something much bigger than just his own case. He had helped expose the deep-seated issues that could no longer be ignored. Darnell sat in his father's office one afternoon, the two of them going over the results of the department-wide changes that had been set in motion. The investigation into Officer Barnes had sparked discussions across the entire department about racial profiling, fairness, and accountability. Policies were being put in place to ensure that every officer was trained to treat citizens with respect, no matter their background. "I'm proud of you, son," Commissioner Caldwell said, looking over some reports. "You made a difference, not just for yourself, but for everyone who will walk through these streets from now on." Darnell smiled, but there was a feeling of quiet satisfaction behind it. This wasn't about fame or recognition. It was about something much deeper. It was about justice and the idea that everyone deserved a fair chance. "I couldn't have done it without you," Darnell replied, his voice filled with gratitude. "You've taught me more than I could ever put into words. But this is just the beginning, right?" His father nodded, a serious look crossing his face. "This is a long road, Darnell, change doesn't happen overnight, but we've taken the first step. Now it's up to all of us to keep moving forward, making sure that everyone, officers and citizens alike, understands the importance of fairness. As they continued to talk, Darnell felt a renewed sense of purpose. He was no longer the young man just hoping for things to improve. He had become part of the solution, a part of something bigger than himself. He had seen how small actions, like standing up for what's right, could ripple out and create change. It was a lesson he would carry with him for the rest of his life. Later that week, Darnell received a message from his mother. She had always been supportive, but now she wanted to make sure they celebrated. She invited him to dinner at their favorite restaurant, and Darnell gladly accepted. After everything that had happened, a simple family dinner felt like the perfect way to reflect on all they had achieved. At the restaurant, as they sat around the table, Darnell couldn't help but feel a sense of peace. His father was right. Change wouldn't come easy, but it had started, and he was proud to be part of it. He could see how much his family had grown from this experience, and the strength they all had to keep moving forward. "I'm proud of you," his mother said, raising a glass. "You've made a real difference, Darnell, and you've made us all proud." Darnell smiled, looking around at his family, his support system. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about building a better world for everyone, one where fairness wasn't just a dream, but a reality. As the night went on, Darnell realized that this was the true meaning of justice, not just a set of rules, but a shared responsibility to stand up for what's right and to make sure everyone is treated equally. He didn't know what the future held, but he was ready for it, because he knew that, no matter what, he had the strength to make a difference. The journey wasn't over. It had only just begun. And with each step, Darnell knew that the world was a little bit closer to the fair, just place that he had always believed it could be.